It's time already to talk about the final car of GT7 1.46, and this one of course is the weirdest. It's a prototype. It's a free vehicle, much like the ambulance, which is probably its biggest saving grace, and it's a car which is not necessarily bad per se, or particularly good. It's kind of neutral. It's almost like grey with a steering wheel, which is kind of appropriate because that's pretty much the kind of colour scheme it comes in already. In fact, to my eye at least, the design that this car has almost looks like if you asked me what the Apple car would probably look like. To me, this looks like something that was made by Apple. It looks like an iPhone that you can drive around. And even though it technically isn't a Vision GT, in many ways it kind of feels like one. For one thing, it's electric. For another thing, you can't really do much to it. In fact, you cannot improve the power, you cannot drop the weight, you can put different tyres on it, thankfully, and of course you can drop the horsepower and increase the weight if you do want to kind of not glitch it, but maybe work it around a little bit to get it into some lower point categories, which incidentally is what I've done. I've got 3 of these because it's free, so why not? I've got one which is quote-unquote fully built, which is well over 500 points. In fact, pretty much as standard, it's 546, which is quite high, to be honest, given how heavy the car is, and we'll get to that in a second. I've got one that's detuned to around 500, and one that's down around 450. I was actually curious to see if you could get this thing down to 400 points, because that actually could be quite useful, very Fisker Karma style in the older Forza games, or the Tesla Model S at the time. You could really game the system, because the top speed wouldn't really change, so you'd have a 400 point car that could still do up around 130 miles an hour, which was quite useful sometimes. You can't really quite do that here, but 450 is fairly low anyway, and in fact, in real terms, it means you've got a car with direct drive, a decent top-end speed for what it is, which is actually a lower point level than a standard version of the Chevy Chevelle, which we have in this update as well. So when you put it in those terms, that's actually not too bad. Now, in terms of the weight, it is very heavy. In fact, it's pretty much the second heaviest vehicle in the game, second only, ironically, to the ambulance. So both of the free vehicles are heavy boys. This one's 2,350 kilos, which is 2.35 metric tons. In other words, that's around the same weight as a Bentley Continental GT, so pretty hefty, not too surprising for an electric car. And in terms of horsepower, it's 482 stock, and of course you can reduce that with the power restrictor. It is of course all-wheel drive. Naturally, being an EV, it's not going to be the most useful thing around, so I think, like I said earlier on, the biggest saving grace by far is that it's free, because it means you have absolutely nothing to waste in having at least one of these in your garage, if nothing else, just to have the collection factor, and you could potentially game the system by lowering the point level. For most players, though, it's probably not a car you'll ever use that much. It does beg the question, though, and of course this is one of the primary things about a review: how does it actually drive? Well, I would say on the one hand, I will give it some praise, because it doesn't actually feel as heavy as it is. Don't get me wrong, it does feel heavy, but it doesn't feel like, you know, the second heaviest thing in the game. I would say it actually feels like it weighs more like 2 tons, and that doesn't sound like much of a difference, but trust me, 350 kilos is a big difference between 2 tons and this. That's literally the kind of difference between, as I mentioned, a Bentley Continental GT, or on the other hand, a Mercedes SL, or a Maserati Quattroporte. That is quite a big difference in weight. At the same time, don't get it twisted. This thing is not going to wow you in any way unless you have less than no expectations. Thankfully, it has nothing to live up to, because it's free. So it's not like, as I said, you have to risk anything. So anything you do get out of it, any kind of use, is just a bonus. To me, it looks like a taxi. It's a prototype, so it's not even technically the finished thing yet. For many of us, you're probably not really going to care. For me, if I was going to choose what electric cars to bring to the game, well, of course, I'd go for stuff more like the Aspark Owl or the Rimac. If you're going to go more in the real-world sense, I'd probably choose maybe something like a Lucid Air over this instead, or a Tesla Model X P100D or whatever. But this one, it's what you've got, of course, being the Sony connection. And talk about having so many different manufacturers involved. You've got Honda, you've got Sony, you've got AFEELA in there. This one is clearly just all about marketing, even more so than the Vision GTs are. It makes total sense that it would be free. They want as many people talking about the car and driving it as possible. Again, like I said with the Skoda, though, Gran Turismo just doesn't really lend itself to giving cars like this that much use, which is kind of counter-marketing if you think about it, because ironically, for a Sony game, I think this car would have actually made more of an impression in Forza. Because in Forza Horizon 5, for example, you can get electric cars to be pretty quick. You can give them more powerful motors, for example, and in the case of something like a Rimac or even a Porsche Taycan, you can genuinely make them stupidly quick. In this game, you just can't. They're very limited on tuning, this one even more so, and the fact that the events really do not favour them means that, like I said, it's kind of counterintuitive. Instead of leaving players with a taste of things to come, you actually leave them with a bad taste in their mouth because you have a car that they weren't asking for, that on top of that you can't do anything to, and then to round it off, you can't really use it for that much either. Although I definitely found it quite amusing that in at least one of the new career mode events, quote-unquote career mode, this one is way out in the lead, and I'm sure some of you who did those new events noticed that, almost like they're really trying to push this thing. It's kind of a nothing burger at the end of the day. Like I said at the start of the video, it's grey with the steering wheel. That's it for my thoughts. I'd love to hear yours down below, especially if you really like the car. Maybe you found that it's really, really good for something in particular. That's it for the 3 vehicles. Of course, stick around for more GT7 content, and I'll see you next time for more. But for now, thanks for watching.